Between her legs there was a smell of dead fish, a whisper remembered in courtly letters and scandalous gossip. It is the phrase that follows the marriage of Henry VIII to a foreign princess like a shadow, vivid, crude, and violent in its intimacy. But it was a rumor first, a king's private revulsion, reported, repeated, and dressed up by those who needed it to mean more than a moment of human disgust. On a January night in 1540, behind the shuttered windows of Whitehall, a single private recoil began to ripple outward until it became a political earthquake. Whitehall in winter is the opening image. Smoke from the kitchens, the scuff of boots on wet stone, ropes of breath that hang in the air like prayer. Candles burn low in oak-paneled rooms. Tapestries, once bright, hang heavy with the damp. The court is a hive of heating and gossip. Politics here moves as much by scent and touch as by rhetoric. At the center of this hive sits a king whose reputation for boldness conceals a body growing treacherous. Henry VIII is power incarnate, a man who has remade religion, defied the Pope, and rewired European alliances. Yet the crown does not protect against the weight of a swollen leg, the slow ache of wounds, the flares of infection, or the denial of what his throne most craves, a secure lineage. By 1540, Henry is 48, a monarch of mythic appetites and human frailties. The jousting that once brought praise had also brought injury. His leg, wounded and often wrapped, is a constant pain and a source of humiliation. His face has the flush of corpulence. His frame is less the athlete of youth and more the sovereign whose movements are measured, deliberate, ready to snap. Murderous public acts, the execution of Anne Boleyn in 1536 among them, sit beside quieter vulnerabilities. The need to confirm a dynasty, the fear that no alliance can be trusted unless it begins with marriage. Every domestic action is political, every bedchamber a treaty. Thomas Cromwell sees this with the clear-eyed logic of a statesman. He is the architect of the king's religious settlement, the man who steadies Henry's revolutionary course. Practical, ruthless, bureaucratic, Cromwell believes in networks, marriages, and paperwork as instruments of state. He has read the shape of Europe as other men read Scripture. For Cromwell, a marriage with the Duchy of Cleves is a masterstroke, a Protestant northern ally, a counterweight to Catholic Europe, a reinforcement of Henry's new religious order. If Henry's heart can be persuaded, and if Holbein's brush can be trusted, then the rest of Europe will bend, or at least be cautious. Hans Holbein the Younger is invited into this plan like a confidant summoned to a royal secret. The German artist moves easily in courts and councils, painting likenesses that flatter and flatteries that persuade. When he travels to the Low Countries and returns with a portrait of Anne of Cleves, it reads to English eyes as both honest and alluring. To Cromwell, Holbein's brush closes a diplomatic deal. The picture will make the king fall in love at a distance, and marriage will follow. To Henry, who has seen many women come and go from court, the portrait arrives like a promise of a companion who might anchor his succession and his politics. Anne of Cleves herself is not a conspirator in English machinations. Born in the Midlands of the Rhineland, daughter of the Duke of Cleves, she is raised in a small court where piety and duty are lessons taught with the same intensity as embroidery and French. Her upbringing is Lutheran in flavor, reserved in gesture, formal in affection. She is trained to be a duchess, to manage households and bear alliances, rarely to perform English courtly seduction. She arrives in London as a dutiful woman, compliant to rank and custom, bewildered by the scale and pageant of Henry's world. She speaks little English. She knows courtly protocol, but not its intimate, performative cruelty. So the scene is set: an ambitious minister, a persuasive portrait, a foreign princess trained for restraint, and a monarch who needs an ally as much as a bedmate. On January 6, 1540, the marriage is celebrated at Whitehall with the ceremonial grandeur Tudor etiquette demands. The hall is filled with nobles, foreign envoys, and the press of courtiers who know that on this night, ostensibly, dynasties will be formed not in treaty papers, but in the private geometry of a bedchamber. The public ritual is everything tradition says it should be. The procession, the vows, the signing of contracts where property and precedents are outlined in legalese that could hammer a kingdom into shape. The servants fold cloth and adjust braids. The lords and ladies make their speeches. Henry, in public, seems the sovereign again, jovial, commanding, the center of spectacle. But ceremony can be a mask. There is always the moment when the mask must be set aside and human needs and fears take center stage. The wedding night, as Tudor sources allow us to picture it, is far quieter than the tapestries and trumpets that have preceded it. The rooms are less lit, the candles gutter. The air is small, and you can feel the cold seep through the mullions. Inscriptions of the day's music linger by the hearth. For Anne, who has been taught that a new marriage is an alliance of duty, the night must have been a study in confusion. Language choked by formality, gestures weighed by the presence of servants, the sudden intimacy of an unknown man whose face is more the subject of rumor than of tenderness. For Henry, expectations are heavily loaded. He has been promised a sight like the one Holbein painted. He expects a companion who will be pleasing without being demanding. The entire court leans into these acts with the seriousness only an absolute state can muster. Anne, bewildered and dignified, consents to the ministrations with the obedience bred into her position. She is not consulted as an equal. She is, in the eyes of many around her, an object to be assessed and repaired. She offers compliance where she can, relinquishes what may be expected, rings, ceremonies, the outward signs of submission, but her interior life is left largely to the imagination of foreign ambassadors who will later write about her simplicity and good nature. The first consequence of the king's private recoil is a court that looks for cause and, crucially, for a villain. Tudor courts are fatal for those who rise too fast, and elevation is a precarious thing. Cromwell has risen rapidly under Henry's favor. His reforms have earned him both power and hatred. He carries in his person the reformation of church and crown, but he also carries enemies among those whose fortunes were threatened by his policies. The Howards, a family with their own appetite for influence, led by the Duke of Norfolk, watch closely. For them, a misstep by Cromwell is an opportunity not only to avenge political wrongs, but to recoup lost ground. Rumor is a weapon sharpened by the ambitious. If the king's dislike is private, it may be made public through the art of insinuation. The Howards, cautious and patient, begin to suggest that the match was ill-advised. His portrait is blamed for flattering Henry into an unequal union. Holbein's artistry is recast as deceit. More dangerously for Cromwell, whispers will not only question his judgment, but his probity. Had he misled the king for his own ends? Had he stitched together a match that served his faction, not the crown? For a while, the court is a pivot between two extremes. One side trying to soothe the monarch's ego and restore his favor, the other quietly sharpening knives. Between them sits Cromwell, who knows how to calculate risks in paper and coin, but perhaps misreads the degree to which private humiliation can be turned into political capital by enemies who smell their chance. He moves to repair the damage by doubling down on administrative reassurance, letters, legalities, the machinery of annulment being set at a later date as a contingency. Yet political enemies do not need proof as much as they need opportunity to plant seed and watch it grow. The rumor itself, in the weeks that follow, takes on the qualities of a Tudor moral tale. It becomes shorthand for the dangers of image over substance, for the way a king's private capacities, or incapacity, can be turned into public catastrophe. Diplomats in Paris and in Rome hear of the king's revulsion.
They write with both fascination and political calculation. Here is a sovereign who may be compromised, they say, and therefore vulnerable. France, Spain, and the Pope listen, because a personal scandal has the capacity to reshape continental strategies.
An alliance meant to shore up Protestant states is suddenly suspect. The very balance Cromwell sought to establish quivers. It is important to hold in mind that not all contemporaries accepted the most lurid versions of the story. Some chroniclers are careful in their language. They report that the king had cause to complain without detailing that cause. Others simply note that the marriage was not consummated. There is an absence in the record that is itself telling. No independent, neutral account written at the time records, in precise terms, what Henry smelled or felt. The most graphic line, the one that our age remembers as a phrase, circulates in correspondence and tainted gossip. And later historians must decide whether it is a literal truth, a political invention, or a psychological outburst refracted through a court that lives by rumor. All the while, Anne carries herself with a restraint that will later seem strategic, if not stoic. She is far from the English court's usual fare. Her piety, simplicity, and lack of English court training make her less able to wield erotic performance as power. To be reduced in rumor to a physical defect is to have one's personhood stripped. Yet she demonstrates a capacity to accept the terms offered her, an annulment that will be framed in canonical law, a settlement of lands and income that will keep her comfortable, a status in England as a sister to the king. There is an agency in her acceptance, however reluctant, that will preserve her life when others around her fall. By the time the court has decided to pursue official remedies, the story's stakes have risen. The king's reaction has been more than a moment of personal rejection. It is being translated into a justification for annulment, for a reassignment of political favor, and for the removal of those who had orchestrated the match in the first place. Cromwell, whose success is tied to the marriage, senses the shifting ground. The Howards, who have long wanted to reassert influence, and who will soon press their niece Catherine Howard into the king's bed, have the motive and the patience to strike. The machinery of Tudor politics begins to shift toward a scapegoating that will have lethal consequences. We must pause here to consider a simple historiographical fact. Rumor and reality are not the same. What contemporaries reported about that January night, and what modern eyes might infer, are separated by centuries of political readwork. Recent centuries have added their own theories, as historians and physicians ask whether an underlying medical condition, today sometimes suggested as trimethylaminuria, a biochemical inability to metabolize certain compounds that can produce a fishy odor, could explain Henry's reaction. Others point to psychological projection, to a king's vanity and paranoia magnifying a minor disappointment into revulsion. Still others insist the whole episode is an invention, a political tool wielded by men who would benefit from Cromwell's fall. Each interpretation tells us less about the body of Anne of Cleves than about the anxieties of the age in which the interpreter writes. But at the moment of the marriage's failure, Tudor men have no language for biochemical syndromes and fewer scruples about converting private sensation into public sanction. They have only rumor, medical ritual, and political appetite. Henry's withdrawal is treated as a fact in need of explanation. That explanation is sought in anatomy and in the social body of court. Holbein's brush, the portrait he painted, becomes part of the story's evidence. So does the king's swollen limb, the cold of January, and the foreignness of the bride. Everything is sifted for cause and for culpability. The solutions that are tried, perfumes, baths, physicians' pronouncements, are as much an attempt to restore the king's confidence as to reconstitute diplomacy. The first few weeks after January are for Cromwell a period of quasi-panic disguised as calm enterprise. He convenes meetings, he writes dispatches to the Duke of Cleves, he arranges for interpreters, and he presses for a narrative that will salvage the alliance while preserving his own reputation. The political center must not appear to wobble, yet the undercurrents of faction are already gathering strength. Men who once smiled at Cromwell in council begin to look him in the face with a different light. Courtiers who owe him favors begin to consider the cost of continued allegiance. And the Howards, patient as winter, begin to plan their move. On the English street, rumor has its own life. Tavern talk and ambassadorial correspondence add texture to the court's official silence. In foreign capitals, the story becomes currency. Someone in Rome writes with a particular relish about a king so great undone by something so small. In Paris, the French court files the report like a cartographer would a map of opportunity. Henry's private recoil has moved from a bedchamber to the ledger of international advantage. A monarch's intimacy has, unwittingly, become Europe's business. It is here, with the court's engines engaged in damage control and enemies already assembling, that the narrative pauses. The marriage has been sealed on paper and in ceremony, yet the promised intimacy has failed to materialize. Baths are bought and physicians consulted. Cromwell moves through the palace like a man trying to mop up a leak in a dam. The Howards watch from the wings. The king withdraws, and in that withdrawal opens a crack the rest of the court will try to exploit. In the hush after that first recoil, when servants speak in whispers and candles gutter low, one can almost feel the machinery of Tudor power begin to reshape itself. What began as a private rebuke to a woman now threatens to redraw lines of patronage, to topple ministers, to change the intimate map of the king's household. The scent that may or may not have been there, whether the product of illness, of fear, or of political invention, acquires a terrible new function. It is no longer only an embarrassment, but a tool. The bedchamber has become an instrument of statecraft. If you find this story intriguing, a medical mystery, a political thriller, or the quiet cruelty of a court that punishes the wrong people, share your thought below. Illness or invention? The question is not idle. It is the prism through which the rest of this tale must be read. For now, the palace exhales and rearranges. Henry retires, perplexed and irritated. Anne, dignified and composed, moves through the rituals of consolation offered her. A bed warmed by attendants, words of comfort from officials who hope she does not see the stakes, visits from curious noblewomen. Cromwell begins the counting of favors and enemies as a man might tally the damage after a fire. The Howards, patient, begin to make their quiet maneuvers. A smile here, an insinuation there, a whisper slipped to a man with the king's ear. Holbein's portrait sits in a room, its painted gaze unreadable. The tapestry of Tudor life has a new tear in it, and every tug pulls at something else. The coming weeks will see baths and council, the first hints of legal maneuvering, and the slow gathering of men who will decide to act. The rumor has done its work. It has given motive to those who were waiting for one. The question of culpability becomes urgent not for Anne, who was protected by her lack of native English court skill, but for the architect who brought her here. Cromwell did not simply arrange a marriage, he arranged his own political vulnerability. So the story pauses at the threshold of escalation. A private recoil has become a public problem. The king's sensation, whether physiological, psychological, or politically manufactured, will be explained, litigated, amplified, and weaponized. The bedchamber's silence gives way, ever so quietly, to the court's scheming voices. The next acts will move fast. Accusations, trials of reputation, the clanking of legal machinery, and, at their end, the very real fall of a minister whose talents once seemed indispensable. We leave the palace there, between a cold bedchamber and a warmer council chamber, with the scent of rumor already in the air, and with men beginning to place their bets. The private moment in January has, in its small human detail, become a catalyst. It has cost some nothing and others everything. It has given to the hungry a reason to pursue their appetite. and it has set in motion a sequence in which perception will be mistaken for proof, and where the intimacies of two people will be converted into the instruments of dynastic and personal ruin. The palace did not, in truth, long pretend that nothing had happened. The hush of the bedchamber had been broken. The hush of the court would not be restored. In the weeks that followed January's private recoil, Whitehall divided itself as if along a seam. On one side, the small, urgent rituals meant to repair a king's confidence. On the other, the slow, patient engines of faction that smelled blood where humiliation had been sown. Cromwell, already a man of paper and process, first responded as he always had, by calculating. He ordered baths. He sent for apothecaries who mixed fragrant brews and swept herbs into copper pots. He dispatched diplomats to reassure the Duke of Cleves, and to explain, with the bureaucrat's coolness, that matters of consummation could be delayed without endangering alliance. He requested opinions from physicians and surgeons, men schooled in humors and cauterizations, men who carried their prognostications in Latin pages that would later be read as prophecies by historians. He attempted, with the careful hands of a statesman, to steady an edifice that had been built on his own design. But statecraft can be clumsy against the soft, human things that court rumor picks up and makes sharp. The Howards, who had never forgiven the rise of this upstart from blacksmith's son to clerk of the council, watched and took their bearings. Norfolk's house had long memories. To them, the king's displeasure, however private, was a lever. If Cromwell's star could be dimmed, if his influence could be returned to the traditional houses of noble power, then the balance of court would shift. The Howards were adept at waiting for a convenient injury and then making it inevitable. They did not need to fabricate facts so much as supply interpretations. Holbein, the artist whose brush had offered a likeness that seemed to promise consolation, was not above suspicion. Had he flattered in paint what flesh would not prove? Was the portrait an instrument of deception, a silent accomplice in a political misreading? The question, once posed in courtiers' whispers, grew teeth. Holbein's integrity as an artist was debated in drawing rooms. More dangerous yet was the insinuation that Cromwell had arranged a match whose benefits were his alone. Among the instruments the court wielded, law and canon were the most serviceable. A marriage within Christendom, in theory, could be undone on technical grounds. Non-consummation was one such ground, an earlier pre-contract another. If the king's marriage could be declared void by reason of impediment, then the political embarrassment could be reframed as a legal remedy. Cromwell moved in this narrow space. He drafted letters, called for counsel from ecclesiastical authorities, and prepared to present a narrative that would save face while preserving the alliance. Yet even administrative foresight could not silence the prying curiosity of men who would profit from Cromwell's fall. The Howards and their allies began to whisper more pungently. Could one trust a minister who had engineered a union that so evidently failed? Had Cromwell misled the sovereign? Had he perhaps sought to extend his influence by drawing the king into a match that bolstered Protestant ties at the expense of older aristocratic networks? Each insinuation need not be proven. It only needed to be believed widely enough to change the tone of council meetings and the angle of private conversations. It was in council that the machinery turned decisively. On June 10, 1540, the same council chamber where Cromwell once sat as architect of reforms became the scene of his arrest. Contemporary accounts, even those sympathetic to him, describe a shocking efficiency. The man who had once directed the legal pages of the realm found himself summoned, restrained, and conveyed away. He was accused of treason and heresy, charges concocted in a court where accusation and political convenience were often indistinguishable. Those who had profited from his tasks no longer wished to be sheltered by his shadow. The arrest, public as it was, had an intimate cruelty.
Cromwell was led through the palace courts past faces that remembered favors and betrayals alike. Men who had signed letters at his command looked away. His arrest signified not merely his personal downfall, but a decisive turn in the court's power balance. To the Howards and their allies, it was a carefully struck blow. To Cromwell's friends, it was a flash of panic and disbelief. He who had remade the machinery of state now watched that machinery grind his fortunes to dust. The trial that followed was, by Tudor standards, efficient. Evidence, some of it political, much of it circumstantial, was marshaled against him. Accusations included misleading the king and altering the sovereign's counsel. The precise legal language was dressed in the ceremonial robes of law, but for onlookers the meaning was simple. The architect of Henry's Protestant course would pay a price for a marriage that had failed. On July 28, 1540, Thomas Cromwell was executed. The scaffold at Tower Hill received him amid cries that mixed relief and triumph. For some, his end was the necessary correction of overreaching ambition. For others, it was an act of revenge thinly veiled as justice. While Cromwell's life ended, the more immediate matter for the king was the shape of his domestic future. Henry, who had found himself repelled in a bedchamber months before, did not long resist the bright-eyed youth who had caught his eye, Catherine Howard, a niece of the Duke of Norfolk, quick of step and coquettish in courtly ways. She represented everything the older foreign duchess did not: English training in flirtation, an ability to read and respond to Henry's expectations, an eagerness that flattered a monarch conversant above all in the language of desire. The match between Henry and Catherine was rapid. Courtship, whispering appointments, a secretive marriage that seemed to promise the kind of conjugal pleasure and political recalibration many at court yearned to see. The contrast was stark. Where Anne of Cleves had been reserved and foreign, Catherine was immediate and what the Tudor court perceived as desirable. Where Anne's presence suggested a diplomatic hedge, Catherine's presence suggested a return to an older, more personal gratification. For the Howard family, the marriage was both triumph and vindication. A niece elevated to queenly power, a minister who had once thwarted their influence dispatched, and a court reordered along lines more congenial to their ambitions. And yet the story's trajectory did not end in the noisier triumphs. The marriage to Catherine, like so many of Henry's domestic choices, would later become its own tragedy. But for the moment, the king's spirits appeared lifted. He had, for a time at least, found the immediate pleasure that his earlier match had failed to provide. The formal annulment of his marriage to Anne, which followed shortly thereafter on canonical grounds of non-consummation and an alleged pre-contract, was a legal tidy-up that turned the private failure into a recognized solution. Anne consigned the trappings of the match, rings and public tokens, with an acceptance that would later be read as shrewd and survivable. Her acceptance deserves close attention. Anne, it must be said again, was not a schemer in English garb. She had been trained in the decorum of a mid-Rhinish court, taught piety and household management rather than the arts of English flirtation. When she found herself the subject of gossip and remedial ministrations, she behaved with restraint. There is a dignity to the historical record about her acquiescence. She consented to the annulment, she accepted the title and the wealth the king bestowed upon her, she transformed an abusive rumor into a life of relative comfort. The formal terms offered to her were generous by Tudor standards. She received lands, a household, and the title that allowed her to remain near the king's household when she wished. She was styled in a way that secured her status and protected her from the fate that had claimed other royal wives. What the court gave to Anne was at once consolation and containment. She was granted a residence, an income, and a place at court that, while reduced from queenly intimacy, allowed her security and an unusual longevity. She would live in England until her death, not as a discarded foreigner, but as a member of the household who had been made, in effect, a royal sister. She maintained polite relations with the king, and later with his daughters, Mary and Elizabeth, who would recall her favorably. She attended feasts and performed the ceremonial duties required of a woman of her station. She never attempted, publicly, to reclaim what had been lost.
Her acceptance, whether from necessity or from character, saved her life. It is worth lingering on the strange mercy of that settlement. In an age when queens were often instruments of faction with perilous ends, Anne's quiet comportment and the pragmatic generosity of Henry produced an outcome both unexpected and, in some ways, humane. She was not executed nor exiled to obscurity. She flourished in manner, kept a household, corresponded with foreign princes when protocol required, and carved out a life that outlived the men who had schemed over her. When Elizabeth later recalled Anne's grace, it was not merely a sentimental memory, but testimony to the ineffable tenacity of a woman who had been, at once, foreign and indispensable. The consequences for others were less forgiving. Cromwell's execution reverberated through the Tudor state. His reforms stalled, the engine he had set in motion faltered without his hand to oil it. The Howard faction regained immediate power, and for a season their ascendancy shaped policy and patronage. Yet power in Henry's court was volatile. Triumph could turn quickly into ruin, as subsequent events in Catherine Howard's brief tenure would show. For the moment, however, it seemed that the court had drawn a lesson. Private offense could be translated into public remedy, and political enemies could be disposed of with legalistic ease. As historians have long asked, it is crucial to separate what contemporaries believed from what evidence supports. The rumor of an odor, so notorious that it lodged in letters and court gossip, operated in several registers at once. To the king, it may have been one thing, a sensory shock married to pain and failing health. To the anti-Cromwell faction, it was an opportunity to weaponize a sovereign's embarrassment into political capital. To messengers and ambassadors abroad, it was a titillating report that could be used to recalibrate continental alliances. To Anne herself, it was an affront that the court translated into an institutional problem she had little power to contest. Modern readers are tempted to resolve the question with contemporary diagnostic certainty. One of the most persistent modern hypotheses is that Anne may have suffered from trimethylaminuria, TMAU, a metabolic disorder that causes the body to excrete a strong fish-like odor when certain foods are consumed or when the body cannot properly metabolize trimethylamine. The syndrome has a biochemical logic and an elegance explanatory. A relatively rare genetic condition could plausibly produce an odor that an unaccustomed nose might find intolerable, especially in an era before modern hygiene and perfumes were commonplace. Proponents of this theory point to the plausibility of an inherited trait and to the physiological changes that could be exacerbated by stress, diet, and infection. But the TMAU explanation has weaknesses that history cannot ignore. First, no contemporary physician recorded a diagnosis that corresponds precisely to modern biochemical knowledge. Tudor medical theorists wrote in humors, not in metabolic pathways. They could smell and prescribe, but they did not possess the tools to determine enzymatic deficiencies. Second, the sources that report a smell do so unevenly and often secondhand. The most lurid phrases come from letters whose authors had motive to dramatize. Third, odor is culturally coded. What is offensive to one nose need not be offensive to another. Transient infections, poor hygiene, clothing unwashed after travel, diet, and even the smell of the palace itself could conspire to create a perception of uncleanliness that had nothing to do with genetic disorder. Alternate explanations therefore remain possible. Henry's own physical decline, his wounded leg, his obesity, his frequent infections and pain could have inhibited his capacity for sex in ways that were later rationalized as sensory offense. Men in pain can recoil. Men with fragile pride can transform that recoil into accusation. Psychological projection is a compelling interpretive frame. A monarch who had been humiliated by failed alliances and betrayed by courtiers could have projected those anxieties onto the body of a wife he scarcely knew. In such a reading, the odor allegation takes on the character of an emotional shorthand for the king's fear that his own faculties were failing him.
Yet another possibility is that the story was politically fabricated or at least politically inflamed. Tudor factions had every incentive to cast the failure of the match as proof of Cromwell's malfeasance. The rumor might have begun as a kernel of truth, a moment of awkwardness, a complaint about pain, and been amplified by men whose livelihoods depended on the king's impressions. As rumor passed from chambermaid to ambassadorial letter writer, it picked up salaciousness that served a purpose larger than any one person's sensory experience. It became ammunition. There is, too, a more structural observation to be made. The way that the human body, smells, wounds, impotences, operates as a political actor in a court culture that equates personal virtue with public capacity. Henry was a king whose men had altered the religious life of his realm, who had made decisions that affected millions. Yet the fate of ministers and the success of policies could hinge, in part, on what happened between the sheets. The yardstick of bodily response, satisfaction or its absence, became a metric of competence. That metric was unreliable and cruel. It transformed intimate failure into public guilt. In assessing these competing theories, historians weigh evidence with caution. They note, as earlier chapters of this tale did, that no independent, neutral observer at the time recorded the precise sensory detail that would satisfy modern curiosity.
The famous phrase is not absent from the record. It appears in letters and later accounts, but it appears precisely in places where rumor and political motive were thick. This silence of contemporaneous, impartial testimony is not proof of absence, but it is reason enough to be skeptical of easy medical diagnoses or of declarative judgments about Anne's body. Anne herself lived with the consequences of those judgments, but she did not live under them. Her life after the annulment was, for a woman of her era, remarkable in its steadiness. She traveled to estates, received ambassadors, and maintained a household that reflected both her Germanic upbringing and her English status. She cultivated friendships in court, including with the king's daughters. She was present at events and lent a quiet continuity to a court that was otherwise in turmoil. Her refusal to engage in scandal, her acceptance of the settlement, and her capacity to fashion a life from what might have been ruin stand in contrast to the furious, volatile politics that had surrounded her brief moment as queen. The human toll for others was not so fortunate. Cromwell's execution closed a chapter of administrative reform in Henry's reign and warned others of the fragility of royal favor. The Howard's ascendancy following his fall foreshadowed further cycles of power and punishment. The king's new bride, Catherine Howard, would later be charged with her own sexual and political transgressions, a reminder that the court's appetite for scandal did not end with one dismissal. The mechanisms that had been used to unmake Cromwell, insinuation, rumor, legal process, would be repurposed in other vendettas. In the end, the Janus-faced quality of the episode is what lingers. It is at once a story about human frailty and a story about political craft. A monarch's physical recoil became, in the hands of ambitious courtiers, the seed of a national drama. The personal became policy. A private reaction would reconfigure patronage, reorder households, and end in an execution that a few short months earlier would have seemed unthinkable. The episode asks us to consider how small, human details, an odor, a pain, a moment of disappointment, can be translated into institutional consequences when the stakes are dynastic and the players are powerful. When we look back on that winter and the summer that followed, there is also an ethical question embedded in historical curiosity. How do we as readers balance the desire for explanation with the dignity of the people who lived these events? Anne of Cleves was more than a rumor. She was a woman whose life was pressured by political exigency. Thomas Cromwell was more than a scapegoat. He was a reformer whose career remade English governance. Henry was more than a monarch undone by personal frailty. He was a sovereign whose private life was inseparable from public rule. To reduce them to caricatures, one as a malodorous object, another as a traitor, would be to misread the complex weave of motives, fears, and opportunities at work. So where does that leave us? If the question is simply whether a certain physiological condition explains everything, the answer must remain inconclusive. Trimethylamine-urea offers an elegant explanation and should be considered among plausible biological causes. So too should infection, hygiene, or transient illness. So too should the king's own bodily pain and impotence. So too should political fabrication. Each theory accounts for certain elements of the record and cannot, on its own, explain the whole. The paucity of direct documentary evidence and the partisan nature of surviving narratives mean that historians must be wary of certitude. What the sources are clearer about is motive. Men sought advantage, and they used the most intimate of a sovereign's humiliations to gain it. There is also a lesson about the nature of power. The bedchamber is where symbols of authority meet the human body. Henry's control over church and realm did not exempt him from vulnerability, and that vulnerability could be exploited. The story demonstrates how perception, whether accurate or not, can be turned into policy and punishment. When perception is quickened by rumor and fed by ambition, it can warp justice. A king's private recoil became, in the hands of factional rivals, the basis for execution. A minister's accumulated enemies needed only a single pretext to finish him. Yet there is an irony at the heart of the tale. The match that toppled Cromwell did not secure the lasting policy gains its architect had hoped for. The alliances he sought fluctuated with the court's fortunes. The Howards' triumph was ephemeral in the larger arc of Tudor politics. Anne, who was meant to be a diplomatic bridge, survived and maintained dignity. Cromwell, whose life had been central to institutional change, did not. History, in this sense, rewards different kinds of endurance. The woman whose body was scandalized outlived the man who had relied on her marriage to cement political order. As for the truth of that January night, perhaps there is no single truth, only overlapping truths. The king may have smelled something. The king may have been in pain. Courtiers may have amplified, interpreted, and weaponized. History often requires us to hold multiple possibilities at once, to sit with ambiguity rather than to flatten it into narrative neatness. The question posed then is not simply what happened, but what did people choose to make of it, and why? When we step out from the candle-bright rooms of Whitehall and look back across the decades, the image that remains is not a lurid one, but a human one. A sovereign whose vulnerabilities were as consequential as his decrees. A minister whose reforms were undone by the churn of court politics. A foreign princess whose acceptance of a diminished role preserved her life and secured for her a rare comfort in a harsh age. If the phrase that launched this tale lodges in memory, it should not do so as an accusation alone, but as a prompt. To ask how quickly bodies become symbols, how easily sensation becomes statecraft, and how personal humiliation can catalyze political catastrophe. Which explanation seems most convincing to you? Was it an undiagnosed medical condition, a wounded king's projection, or a deliberately manufactured scandal designed to bring down a minister? The documents leave room for all three answers, and perhaps the truth sits at the intersection of them. Share what you think in the comments. Your theory will join the long chorus of interpretation that has surrounded this episode for nearly 5 centuries. If this dive into Tudor corridors and courtly cunning appealed to you, subscribe and tell us which explanation you find most persuasive. The past is full of intimate surprises, and the way we read them tells us as much about our present as it does about theirs.